to launch our meeting. This is, I believe, our second research seminar of our small but great international laboratory. And today we have our guest researcher from European Institute University Florence, and also from our big friend Germany, Yonasa Драйгер, who will tell us his view on a very intricate and interesting topic. Will we survive? I mean, by will I mean Russia, of course. Another nuclear arms race. The experience of the Cold War was quite negative. But here in Russia we don't believe in historical experience, we believe only in our spirit, and probably Jonas will give us a different point of view, or not. So, Jonas?
Yeah, I'll see about that. Thanks, Dima. Just in case I'm not speaking loudly enough or too loudly, which sometimes happens when I speak, just raise an arm and inform me about that fact. So, the project name has already been named. Can Russia afford another nuclear arms race? And you will see that in strictly alphabetical order there are two people here. The first one is me. The other one is Rich Maher. He is an American security scholar, also located at the European University Institute. And we had the idea, upon him learning that I would go to Russia, we had the idea to aim for, let's say, 8,000-word article to be written in a venue like, and I'm not sure how much that is read here, a venue like International Affairs, the Chatham House publication, which, you know, takes a middle ground approach to theory and aims to be very practical and applied and so forth. So that is basically what we are seeking to achieve. And every feedback that I can gather here on either the Russian perspective or on scholarly suggestions about this are highly welcome. You will see here a relatively fixed structure, as if we already have a very clear idea how this will look like in the end. However, this is simply for the sake of giving you a preliminary argument which you can then deconstruct and either affirm or criticize, bring down, and make other suggestions. So that as a preliminary remark. My apologies that I'm not doing this in Russian. It's getting better, and I tried to outline my research project to my language teacher the other day, and it worked well, but she is a very patient and good woman, and I think it's better for this venue when we can focus on the meat of the argument. All right, so considering the audience here, I think I don't need to overemphasize certain things. So in the article, we would first lay out that there is indeed, it's not a ridiculous idea to ask the question. That is basically our goal there. And there we would make a two-stepped argument. We would say, well, okay, there is a clear US drive for nuclear prevalence. Again, I don't think I need to emphasize this here. This has not been invented with Trump. It's an old dynamic. The ABM treaty scrapping of 2002, for example, and the whole issue about the stationing of ABM infrastructure in Poland and in Romania, etc., etc. So suffice it to say that with Trump that has been accelerated. There's more hostile rhetoric. There is a naming of Russia as a strategic competitor, which I think is new language. Then the Nuclear Posture Review 2018, the US has announced, always to be taken with a grain of salt, a nuclear modernization of about $1.2 trillion in the next 30 years. So at least from the ballpark figure and from the dimension, this is like in the same playing field as the whole Russian economy. So 1/30 of Russia should be spent by the US additionally per year on modernizing its nuclear potential. So that is not trivial, we contend. Now, looking to the other side, of course, and again, I don't think I need to argue too much for this point. Russia continuously pursues great power status, strategic autonomy, however you want to call it. We pick this Putin quotation as something that is very straight to the point, a suggestion that messing with Russia might entail nuclear escalation, and that Russia keeps on upgrading its deterrence forces in order to do that. People familiar with Russian strategic outlooks are familiar with the concept of strategic de-escalation. And whenever I tell students about that, I need to explain to them that this sounds very benign, but that it actually means that one feels free in a conventional encounter to use nuclear weapons to de-escalate the conflict, which, of course, has all sorts of threatening implications. Now, we can run through the familiar stuff, Russian countermeasures against American steps, Putin's Munich speech, the 2017 allegations by the US that that Russia is in breach of the INF Treaty by the development of new styles of missiles that fall under it, deployment of Iskander missiles to Kaliningrad, which could be equipped with nuclear weapons, and the announcement that there would be infrastructure for nuclear weapons and eventual deployment in Crimea, which adds yet another beautiful dimension because in the view of the West, this is not even Russian territory. All right. So we want to focus our efforts on two research questions. The first one is, to what extent could Russia match U.S. nuclear efforts? You can see there's the implied assumption here that the U.S. could do more than Russia. So we are asking to what extent. And I mean, we could now debate this proposition, but I think it's fairly straightforward. Second, it's then of course interesting to know, once we have more or less established how far Russia could go, what the costs and obstacles are that Russia would face in such an effort. And you guys are all regional experts, so I don't need to outline how ambitious these questions are. So again, we are not trying to write the definitive monograph on that. We are trying to write a theory-informed best guess on an empirical question that lies in the future, to put it as complicated and simply as possible at the same time. So, I guess I also don't need to make much for the case that a nuclear arms race would be bad for both sides. We would probably, and we are not quite sure where to do that and how much we should do that, we would probably contend that the consequences would be worse for the Russian state and the Russian society as for the West. And why we are arguing this will hopefully come clear when I go to the empirics. Theoretical framework. It looks fairly simple. There are all sorts of complications in there. We are well aware of that. So far, we are simply, quite bluntly, taking as a dependent variable the very research question, can Russia afford a nuclear arms race? And the first thing that you then have to think about is, okay, so what kind of arms race are we even talking about? I will come to that. So this is the one factor. You first need to know how severe an arms race we are talking about before you can ask the question, can Russia match it or not? So that is basically the, shall we say, the cost side of the arms race. And then, or of the ability to provide an arms race. And then we are at the supply side with the three factors outlined here. So we think you need a certain technological base to contend in an arms race. You need the ability to develop certain capabilities, especially because, and that's what we gather from military experts, especially because a new nuclear arms race would most likely be mostly a qualitative one rather than a quantitative one, as in the early Cold War. So if you don't have the capabilities, you can't do a nuclear arms race. Then you need the economic resources that are necessary for that. We don't mean that so much in terms of uranium and whatever you need there, because as we all know, Russia is a big country and has plenty of strategic resources of its own. We mean more the economic capabilities to fund the technological capabilities that then allow you to actually partake in an arms race. And then, and it's sometimes hard to distinguish the second and the third factor, societal support. So in how far is the Russian population ordinary citizens, but also more privileged and wealthy parts of it and more powerful parts of it, in how far are they willing to accept the many ramifications of an arms race. So we believe that these four variables provide the analytically most powerful and yet empirically most manageable framework for this. Now, you are keenly aware, this seems like a bin bag model where you simply you say something about all the variables. We are a bit more sophisticated than that, in that we are disaggregating a little bit. So, scenario-wise, first, we think that two scenarios are important to talk about. The one thing is the extreme scenario where we believe there is a dynamic where the United States would put in as much effort as it did during the Cold War. So if you could perfectly measure this, you would simply look at how much have they spent, how much have they developed at the height of the Cold War, and then you apply that to today's US economy, and then Russia would seek to match that. That's the extreme scenario, which we believe is so unlikely that it borders at the impossible, but it's an important ideal type to keep in mind. The second one, and that is where the terminology is awkward, because we are speaking about a severe arms race, but not an extreme one. So we have called it moderate, which is misleading, but we haven't found a better term yet. It entails that Russia basically, from its current nuclear efforts, doubles its efforts in the technological sphere, in the economic sphere, and then necessarily so also in the societal sphere. What that means in terms of measurement is a completely different question, has its own problems, and I will speak a bit about it. Now, research design, fairly straightforward. We are taking the cost side of the arms race, moderate arms race, extreme arms race, and then we are trying to assess values for technological potential, economic resources, societal support, and then we reach our answers. And I will give it to you right here so that you know to which argument I'm arguing to. So the moderate arms race scenario where Russia basically doubles its efforts, we would suggest that yes, Russia would be able to do that, but there are a significant host of costs and risks involved. Extreme arms race where Russia tries to match a United States that is really determined on winning an arms race, we would say it would probably not be able to achieve this, and on the way, the attempts of doing so would be very costly and very risky for all sorts of Russian national interests. So, a little bit more about research design. We, for each scenario, moderate and extreme, we assess the three variables, always asking, are Russian capabilities sufficient in that area? We see these three variables as necessary conditions. So the lowest value within a scenario of the three variables determines the overall assessment. So if you have great technological capabilities and wonderful societal support, but your economic base is horrible, then your prospects of winning out in the arms race are also horrible because you simply can't pay for it, just as an example. Measurement, highly context dependent. We are using very different indicators. We are just trying to take it where it stands and use the data that is relatively freely available. I will speak about sources a bit more. We extrapolate from current trends and whatever we deem most likely scenarios to be. And we rely a lot on expert assessments. Most of them secondhand, but I have conducted some interviews here with some experts in the area, both Russian and Western, and some diplomats from the West and not yet from the Russian side, but hopefully that will happen. Okay, as I said, we are using major foreign policy documents because we believe they are a focal point for actual strategic thinking, at least in an indirect way. Some interviews, expert analyses, newspapers, comparative statistics. Okay. So, to go into the empirics a bit, and now I'm pretty sure we will get confused. Okay, are we speaking about extreme or moderate scenario? Are we speaking about technology, economy, or society? I will try to flag these differences. Keep in mind that I'm trying to fill this table while I'm doing this, okay? And I'm going by variable, so I speak about technological extreme, technological moderate, economic extreme, economic moderate, and so forth. Starting with technological. So here in the extreme scenario, we are saying quite clearly, I was looking for something that is stronger than probably, but not as strong as certainly. Haven't quite found it. So insufficient, we would say, in the extreme scenario. Simply because, as I already said, future nuclear arms race would be mostly qualitative, not quantitative. What do you need for that? You need a very innovative society with lots of brain power. And there, I'm not trying to be impolite in my host country, but it's just, it's no contest, basically. So the worldwide average in research and development spending, as established by the World Bank, is 2.2% of GDP. The US is at about 2.8. Russia is at about 1.3. One could argue, well, that leaves you lots of room to improve, but that entails costs, and we will come to that. Top universities, the study that we looked at had 33 of the top 100 universities in the world in the US, and only one in Russia, which was Lomonosov, I think. Then we also look at world intellectual property indicators. We are looking at patents, basically. And they're just, it's orders of magnitude away from each other. And that doesn't only apply for the absolute numbers. The US is also far more efficient in translating its GDP into patents. So per GDP, the US is in the top 10 when it comes to successful patent applications. Russia is not in the top 10. I haven't checked where exactly it is. So, as you can tell, we are trying to triangulate these factors by approaching them from different angles, and then saying, so taking all of this together, we believe Russia couldn't match the US in the technological sphere in an extreme scenario. So moving on like this, we now go to a moderate arms race scenario. And there it gets, of course, a bit murky, but we would say that a fictitious doubling of efforts that Russia would be capable of. And one of the reasons for that is that Russia has already a huge nuclear force and has a lot of nuclear experience that in a way is unbroken since the beginning of the very nuclear age. So these data are from the most current military balance of the IISS, and what you basically see here are the strategic delivery systems for nuclear weapons. So you do that with a nuclear triad. You either use intercontinental ballistic missiles, or you throw them with bombers, or you use nuclear-powered submarines. And there you can see dark blue is the US, and then that, oh gosh, what color is that? Brown, I think. Brown is Russia, respectively. So these numbers are very much on par, if you want to see it like that. Active nuclear warheads, as measured by a study in the bulletins of atomic scientists, also roughly similar at about 4,000. So we are saying the fact that this is here means that around that you have a community of researchers, engineers, employees, and so forth that have capabilities. So you can use these people to train other people and so forth. Crude thing to say, but as a point of comparison, if you would ask how quickly could, for example, Pakistan up its nuclear arsenal, it would be an issue on how many experts they actually have. And everything else being equal, we contest Russia stands better there. So that is something to be said that they could do moderate efforts. Again, moderate, quote unquote. We also take note of the fact that from Russian people that are from American experts and American strategists, we get signals of genuine concern. So they are looking very closely at what Russia is doing. Granted, they are also looking at what China is doing, but we know that the factors there are slightly different because China could be, as they like to say, a genuine peer competitor. So the concern about the Russian arsenal seems to be much more about the direct nuclear balance as we see that. So we get from American experts and policymakers and diplomats an active concern about this. So that reflects that there is, from the American side, an assessment that Russia could cause further problems. So apparently the hype thing right now, where the Russians are doing a good job, is hypersonic missiles, which are so quick and erratic in their course that they are very hard to fend off, which increases first strike abilities. Apparently. I always preface this by saying I'm a civilian. Experience in existing arsenal I already mentioned. Then we all know that Russia commands a very capable espionage system and secret services, so that it counts for something if you are involved in a nuclear arms race. And we also point to the literature on war making and societal mobilization, where basically the framework is democracies do very well in long-term conflicts that involve all of society. Autocracies are very good in mobilizing short-term and very straightforwardly. And we can cite examples from the recent past where Russia was able to do that. So that is also something that we would say would allow Russia to go quite a long way. Turning to the economic potential. And here again in the extreme scenario. And here, and this is probably, we have probably all encountered this, most likely Russian capabilities are insufficient here. So this is a comparison of overall military spending. I'm pretty sure you guys know the numbers. So the very dark column is US military spending, and then I think the Russian one is the third one. So yeah. Here. So it's quite straightforward. I submit. The same goes for GDP, where again the United States is here in 2010. Here it's measured as if the EU has a slight edge. Then comes the US. Russia is here. I think this is even by purchasing power parity, which always makes Russia look better, although I'm not entirely sure whether it is PPP on this one. But on all indicators, on all macro indicators, Russia is not doing well in comparison to the US. And there are like several dimensions in between. Now, again, to bang on about it, one estimate that we found about US spending on its nuclear forces, average spending between 2010 and 2018, was about $20 billion US. If this is a surprisingly low amount to you, then you feel just as I did when I found out about this, but I will come to this. So about $20 billion US, and if then you factor in dark numbers, it might even be like $50 billion US. And if this more or less approaches the reality, it's actually quite close to overall Russian military expenditure, which includes the several thousand tanks and the 900,000 active military personnel and so forth and so forth. Okay, so I hope I banged home that point sufficiently. If we now speak about a moderate scenario, where Russia seeks to double its efforts, and the economic sphere is where this measure of doubling comes from actually, there we would say, Russia would be quite clearly able to do this. And there are several things that speak to that. So there is a study by a guy called Cooper, who is at the Oxford Changing Character of War program, which is led by Andrew Monaghan, who I think is sometimes here, and who also happens to be connected to the Alpha Fellowship program. So this Cooper person has made a very interesting study where he tries to estimate the overall costs of Russia's military program involving the warheads and the delivery systems. And his estimation is, like, in the long run, in the last few years, that the costs of the current Russian nuclear program are about $10 billion US. Again, a number that I found surprisingly low. And it's about 15% of Russian Federation military expenditures, or 4.5% of the overall federal budget right now. So now, if you were to imagine that Russia would double its efforts, the expense, that would mean raising military expenditure by 15% and spending 4.5 of the federal, an additional 4.5 of the federal budget. And we contend that this, it's in a democratic nation, it would be every politician's nightmare. But heeding what I said about hybrid regimes and mobilization in tense situations where you can also control the media narrative to a degree, but now I'm bleeding into the societal factor, this is feasible. Like Russia could pay for this if you just talk about brute numbers. Now, societal support. And this, we believe, is the actual crucial variable. We follow what I think is more or less consensus, or let's say mainstream opinion in the expert community, that a very strong operative interest in Russian foreign policy is regime stability, and that contrary to certain depictions in Western media, regime stability also rests on a contract with society, like a certain amount of bourgeois Gemütlichkeit and not too much trouble in your everyday life, economic development and progress and so forth. So, now, taking these assumptions on, we would submit that in an extreme arms race scenario, it's highly doubtful that the Russian society would go along. And let me just outline why that is. There is some evidence, we haven't looked deeply into this, but there is some evidence that the Russian population has some amount of nuclear skepticism, so some worry about nuclear escalation. So in 2015, when President Putin spoke in very robust terms about the potential of nuclear escalation, that Russia wouldn't back down, that Russia is investing in its forces, the Levada Center made a poll, and I looked for implications in the results, and let me phrase it like this. 75% of respondents said that they were worried by the words of President Putin. So there were only 25% that were saying after these statements that they are not more concerned now about nuclear escalation. So we take that as weak evidence for the proposition that there is some nuclear skepticism in the population, which would probably increase when tensions are rising in an extreme scenario. Remember, we are speaking about extreme right now. Then we think the strongest mechanism for societal support waning in the scenario is that it would divert a lot of resources away from all sorts of other economic possibilities towards the military-industrial complex, where, of course, there's also private money to be had, but not so much and not with so many people. So we believe the elite contract would suffer under this, and there would be some major reshuffling, maybe even infighting and so forth. And that is something that, in our reading of Russian domestic policy, is something that the power centers in Russia like to avoid when possible. So the elite has an interest also in good relations with the West. That's another mechanism that is at work there. An extreme nuclear arms race doesn't come without conventional confrontation, without all sorts of sanctions and so forth. So we submit that would also play a big role. There is a lot of comparative research on hybrid regimes and on hybrid economies, which arguably Russia is. You know, it's neither Saudi Arabia nor Germany. That these kinds of regimes are reliant on a popular perception of growth, welfare, responsible spending, and so forth. And our contention would be that that would suffer in an extreme arms race scenario. And you don't have to look further than the current pension reform to see that this really has done something in the Russian society. I know Putin approval ratings are the favorite target of statisticians to be skeptical about. We nonetheless think it's a somewhat useful measure. So it is correlated with government performance and Russian perceptions on how the country is going. And you can see that in times of crises with the West, Putin's approval rating indeed went up, disapproval rating went down. So this small bump here is the Iraq crisis. Then you have the events leading up to Georgia, and then, of course, you have the famous Crimea effect. But if you see here, there is a slump from about 80 to about 60%, which is a level that ranks among the lowest that Putin has had so far. And we take from that simply that, yes, international crises sometimes help with popularity, but there is also a correlation with economic issues, especially when they are politicized. So the pension reform was a one-off thing, something that was very tangible and that you couldn't really blame on other actors. And we would deduce from that crass spending in an extreme nuclear arms race would fire back on the regime. So I'm starting to close up, hopefully. We also think that societal support is the most doubtful variable when it comes to the moderate scenario. And here we are not entirely certain. I'll just give you what we have so far. We would suggest that at least short term, and I have tried to point this out in the Putin approval rates, that great power performance is something that is highly valued in the Russian population. It's a narrative that can easily be pushed by the media, especially when there is an event on which it can be pushed. So I don't think I need to get into detail there. There's some polling done on where Russians think international respect comes from. And that is very interesting because they think that in general it comes from economic growth and the welfare of citizens. And then when you ask them about Russia specifically, then they say it comes from strength and nuclear weapons, which is something that the statisticians try to wrap their head around. But that is something that apparently plays a role in regime support. Perceptions about economic performance are much better than in 2000, unsurprisingly. This is something to be factored in. So there is some leeway, is what we are arguing. And rally around the flag effects and anti-Americanism and anti-Westernism would be, of course, increased in an arms race scenario, and therefore there is another source of regime legitimacy that could be tapped into. And I mean, again, you know how attitude towards the US has been progressing in the last decades. And we find that supports our general proposition. So, that leads us back to the overall framework. Moderate arms race scenario, extreme arms race scenario, 3 variables, overall conclusion. And as I already told you, we take from our overall assessment that yes, Russia could afford a moderate arms race, but there would be significant costs and risks involved. And for the extreme scenario, we would say probably no, and attempts to do so would be costly and risky for all segments of Russian society. So yeah, this is our awkward coding so far. I will just let it stand there. We can hopefully get back to it. So, looking at the time, I would now thank you for your patience, and I'm very much looking forward to your comments, suggestions, devastating deconstructions, and so forth. And here are some of the questions that we think would be most important to consider. So, thank you very much. Looking forward to the rest of this.
I can start. Well, thank you for a very nice presentation, for a very thorough approach, which I can appreciate to this question, and studying it in a very empirically sound way and some theory behind it. So I have a few suggestions, right? So the first one, you kind of set this, the moderate one is Russia has to double its spending on arms. But is that really the case, right? What do you mean by arms race in the modern, kind of context, right? We have this kind of doctrine of, some kind of strategic sufficiency. Do you really have to match the U.S. missile for missile, or what's enough, right? Mm-hmm. So if, we look at, the Cold War and what we learned about nuclear weapons, they're good for basically for two things, right? They're good for deterrence, and they're good for prestige. Compellence, right? We have more than you, and you have to do what we want, which the U.S. tried to do when it was the only one that had nuclear weapons or what had much of a bigger arsenal than the Soviet Union didn't really work out. So if Russia's goal in an arms race is to maintain deterrence, does it really have to spend all that much more than it does now? And even if the goal is just to maintain prestige, does it have to? We can look at like North Korea, right? You know, how many nuclear weapons do they have? They have a couple dozen, maybe at most. But it seems like they can deter the United States, which has, you know, maybe 100 times more nuclear weapons than North Korea does. And it seems that it does pretty well for a country that's so, you know, poor in terms of any other resources, in terms of its prestige. So is the baseline of, you know, Russia keeping up in an arms race much smaller than what you have as the moderate scenario? That's my first comment. The second comment would be about China. So I think you kind of are underestimating the degree to which this new nuclear posture by the, and we still haven't really gotten there, right? You know, this is kind of all in discussion. But is it motivated by Russia or more by China? And trying to really bait China into an arms race. So, you know, I think China was one that, you know, it really learned from the Soviet experience. I think the political leadership has here as well that, you know, trying to outspend a bigger economy and one that's more dynamic in terms of technology won't work, right? It leads to ruin. And the Chinese were able to, you know, very kind of minimal nuclear posture, strategic sufficiency, able to, you know, use deterrence pretty well against the United States. And so is this really motivated by China? And then how would China play into these scenarios, right? China has the resources maybe to back Russia, or, you know, the U.S. has to face potentially two, you know, nuclear powers which are sort of hostile to it and that can deter it.
Yeah.
And I promise this is the last comment, right? But in terms of, you know, I like that you've started, you know, I think we should always start with kind of in mind what the end product is. This is, you know, an IA article. You know, I think the approach is very sound. I think, you know, you're very clear about what questions you ask, but I'm wondering, is this enough, right? I mean, we all kind of come into this article, even before reading it, knowing that, you know, expecting these findings by you, right? And even here at the end, you say even this moderate arms race is something that you see as being unlikely. So even that moderate arms race is unlikely. So maybe play around, you know, a lower bar for the moderate one might be better. Because I don't see them maybe, I mean, you know, a sound article is something that should be, and I think we should empirically test even things that we feel are obvious, but will this be enough for, you know, IA is a very picky journal, as I have learned on many occasions.
Right. Thanks, Andre.
Yeah, may I also say a few words. Unfortunately, it was first because it's exactly the thing I was going to say.
That's why I knew you guys were. So.
Yeah, you see, if Russian leadership learned a lesson from the collapse of the Soviet Union, so that lesson would certainly be the unacceptability of the deep arms race. Putin talks about it every several months. He is. No, we can, of course, question his words, to what extent he's sincere, to what extent he's genuine, but he basically says that Russia sees that perspective and will not allow to draw Russia into the arms race. And that is why the analytics you're doing is very fine, but it is very, very rational, very Western style. Which is not exactly, because we have to return to the basics, I think, to the issue of deterrence and unacceptable damage. Will the United States be prepared to exchange the whole Russia for one New York? Yeah. Probably not. So the framework question, I think, may be developed a little bit further, because you are writing as if we're repeating the previous arms race as it was. And you yourself saying that it will be a qualitative one. And if you look at what Russia is doing militarily, Russia does almost nothing for defensive capability. Something is being done, but not much. Yeah, what Russia does is actually makes sure that the price will be high. Yeah, you may have just one Wunderwaffe, Yeah? Not 2,000, just one. But it is already enough. It is already enough. Yeah. And little things, small things concerning specific arguments or things you are doing in comparisons. Again, I have some uneasiness with some of them.
Mm-hmm.
For example, comparing the share that goes to research and development as a percentage of GDP. But you see how much of American research and development is devoted to the development of softer toilet paper, and how much goes for military needs. Yeah? How much in Russia it is. The number of patents. Are you sure Russian arms companies publish their patents? Yeah? Or do patents at all? Yeah? Engineers, the universities. You see, again, on the background of already having this experience, you accept it. Maybe we don't need 30 excellent universities to run an arms race. Yeah? Maybe one Dr. Evil is enough. Yeah? With a good laboratory. That's enough. I think things are not totally fit the case. They are good to compare generally, but don't fit very well the case of arms race and of this deterrence and of this unacceptable damage, stuff like that. Then, rightfully, you develop a thesis on societal support, but you see, Russian society is not being consulted on such matters. Yeah? There is no vote whether we should invest more arms in nuclear arms or not. Yeah? Society is not even being informed of this. Yeah? That is why the only thing society may judge is that the taxation increased and we don't feel nice. Yeah? But it is not the matter of discussion whether this money goes for nuclear weapons or for anti-ballistic missile defense or anything else. These areas are totally closed from the general public, and societal support, I think, is not an important issue here. The general level of welfare is, and it matters. And yes, if the government spends too much on military, the society will feel that, and we might expect some counter-reaction. But you see, again, the historic lesson is that Soviet Union got bankrupt not because of the nuclear weapons. This is relatively cheap. It got bankrupt because of the conventional forces and navy, which is expensive. Yeah. Nuclear weapons is relatively cheap. Once you developed the technology and made investment in research, after that you simply multiply the effect. It's not that expensive. I don't know to what extent my comments are useful or not, but I would return to the basic thing. I would think a little bit more about the central research question. Mm-hmm. Shall we really discuss the arms race itself, or maybe you should go? I don't have a proposal. Yeah? But again, the impression is that we are returning back to 1960s, 1970s and measuring, how many weapons do they have, how many weapons Russia has, and, comparing that. It is not the case anymore. Moreover, Chinese experience gives a good example of this. Now they started, I think, to develop their forces further, but for all these years, they kept their nuclear arsenal on a very low level. Because their thinking was that having, I don't remember how many do they have, but significantly less. Ways less than United States, I said. But even this small arsenal of weapons can deliver an unacceptable damage. And again, exchange in New York for the whole China. And the example of North Korea is the same. So I think it is not a nuclear arms race, it is something else you are really thinking about.
Yeah. We'll link up to that directly. I'm also wondering whether the issue of nuclear arms is too broad a term. I think you have to look more carefully at the posture. If you look at the Cold War, you had a period where you had these free-falling bombs of the Hiroshima type at the beginning, and then a constant move up until the 1970s to nuclear warfighting capabilities. So on all levels, including nuclear mines, which were planted in Germany, I think I remember. And then, with the SALT agreement, you had a gradual shift towards reassuring, if you wish, MAD. And what we are now in is basically making sure that this mutually assured destruction, MAD, really works. And that links up currently to two things. One is this famous Russian term, разумная достаточность, which was created in the 1980s, and which is, I assume, still valid. And the second is, which doesn't show up at all in the presentation or in your work, is ABM. Yeah, I mean, ABM is a true risk for a minimum deterrence, which would be quite sufficient. And I don't expect anybody, and I don't see any technological development which leads us back, even the miniaturization, which is a nuclear posture review, somehow, but still on the Hiroshima scale, that this would lead to a re-emergence of nuclear warfighting capabilities on all levels. And if that is true, we are not in a new arms race. Then, at best, asymmetry is a rule of the game, and that is a popular term these days. And then the whole thing crumbles, I'm afraid.
Sorry, once more?
The whole exercise crumbles, I'm afraid.
Could you reiterate that? Because I'm not entirely sure whether I understood all aspects of it. So, you're contending that old school nuclear arms race escalation works by a different mechanism of the technological developments that are happening now. Did I get that right?
No, I mean, the issue now is about securing a minimum deterrence. Mm-hmm. That is not a costly exercise. Mm-hmm. It is only becoming a serious problem, and most probably, according to the technological age of the United States, on the Russian side, if ABM becomes feasible. That might happen in 20 years' time, 30 years' time, 50 years' time, nobody knows. Yeah.
Right.
Well, it may never happen. It might never happen.
It might never happen.
Most likely it never happens.
Star Wars, this great Reagan exercise was up in the air. Mm-hmm. That is the only thing. I do not see, and that is a crucial point, if you get into a new arms race and you have equality on all different levels, you are again contemplating about extended deterrence, decoupling, and all this bloody stuff. Then you are in a real arms race, which is a damned, also on the nuclear level, a damned costly exercise. Mm-hmm. But I don't expect that. Yeah. And I don't see neither technological trends, if that was a point you were referring to, nor do I see doctrinal trends which point into that direction. Mm-hmm. On either side.
Okay. So lots of these things I will simply take in and will try to think with my colleague about how to shift out these problems. I just want to comment on a few to maybe clarify what our limited goal here is. So one of the things that we were saying from the start is we will not at all concern ourselves with the issue of a probability of an arms race actually happening. Because there we side with the sentiment that I feel here, namely that even whatever a limited nuclear arms race would exactly look like, we find that very unlikely, and we find it next to impossible that both societies would try as much as they can to just focus on each other and maximize their defensive and offensive nuclear capabilities. And we contend that we can focus on the mere question whether Russia could sustain this by the fact that this is a big topic, not just in the newspapers, but that strategic planning staff and so forth are wondering, worrying, anticipating, talking about this. And that justifies the question, to what extent would Russia be able to do this? What would be the costs that it would entail? Because it's something that is already being worried about. So that is the niche that we are trying to stake out for us. It's hard to separate that from the question of causes, especially because there are so many, especially experts, that are saying, well, I mean, why worry about it? It's not going to happen, you know. But we contend that there are sufficient people that think it could happen, that it warrants to answer an important empirical question that lies there. We are also, one of the things we're also wondering about is whether we should speak about a general arms race at the conventional and the strategic level, because it frankly doesn't make a lot of sense to have only one. And there, so far, we thought we might avoid more open flanks by focusing on nuclear simply and keeping the text as small as possible by not including conventional. Maybe a shortcut would be that in the extreme scenario we would say certainly this would come along with conventional arms races, where Russia, for all sorts of reasons, is even worse positioned, just by matters of economic potential and so forth. About the not getting into a deep arms race, part of the way in which we want to sideline the whole causes thing is to say, yeah, it would be irrational to get into an arms race. But that's what arms races are. You can model them in a rational way, but arguably we wouldn't quite expect the empirical patterns of the Cold War if we applied mere rationalism. Arms races are about more, and you already mentioned it's about signaling also great power status and so forth. Yeah, okay, we can be agnostic about it, and we can simply say that in history there have been arms races that you can feasibly call irrational. So therefore it's a theoretical possibility out there that we need to discuss in its implications. And one of the implications is, could Russia sustain it? Because we can assume that the United States would be able to sustain it more than Russia. And with Russia we are furthermore concerned because if there were such a crash scenario, what happens with the economy, what happens with the regime and so forth, which is why we think it's useful to disaggregate the different aspects of it. And a technological arms race a qualitative arms race can turn quantitative. So if you build a lot of ABM capabilities, after a while you start to do the number counting, okay, how many of our Wunderwaffen do we need to sidestep all these ABM systems? So if the logic is there, then you can get into a quantitative dimension as well. And we only need the possibility to discuss our question. And that's the argumentative strategy we would pick. And the last thing, this is the second time that I've heard the term Wunderwaffe said here in Russia. And I guess we all know the historical context and the nasty connotations of it. I'm just wondering, is the term Wunderwaffe maybe in the Russian form actually used in the more public discourse, or is this...
I don't think so. I mean, people know it, but I don't think they use it widely.
No, they don't.
Okay.
It didn't turn out so well for the Germans.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I mean, fortunately as well, yeah. But I mean, it would be a particularly nasty historical analogy, I guess. Okay, so that's all that I just wanted to add on what I had said.
If I can just respond.
Sure.
Yeah, sure. Go first.
Just to what you just said, I think that yes, I very much sympathize with it. I think it's a good idea to sort of cut out this niche. But you're going to have to be much more clear about that than you are here. I caught it at the beginning, but it wasn't necessarily very clear, right? So you're talking about, something worth looking at, not a probable scenario, but a plausible scenario. Mm-hmm. I think you can also strengthen the case by doing what you did, right? So you have this extreme version, right, which is an easy thing to kind of kill empirically, right? Which is the match missile for missile, system for system. And then there's the second one, which is a limited one, right? So I feel like doubling is arbitrary. Why double, right? So what I think you should do is say, well, what does Russia need to do in order to, let's say the U.S. increases this 1 trillion, or Trump goes even farther, to maintain deterrence, and secondly, to maintain the prestige and status that the weapons confer. Because that's really what's important, right? And I'd say that the baseline is much smaller than that, right?
Oh, okay.
But not without costs, right? And we can see that these have costs and have some other kind of repercussions. So I think that would be a much more kind of plausible, kind of probable, a more interesting discussion for a journal like IA. And also more sophisticated, because right now, what's the rationale for increasing double or matching? This would give you a much clearer, right? That, okay, Russia is looking to do it because of, first, maintaining deterrence and then prestige. And then when you talk about deterrence, a lot is going to be contingent on, this ABM system, most of us believe will never work, but it just might, right? So, or maybe, more importantly, maybe people will start to believe that it does work, right? Because, you're only going to test this thing, see if it works once, right? So maybe the belief that it does work will be more accepted, and then we'll be in an arms race. So, putting all those kind of contingencies out there to justify your kind of research question, your puzzle, is sort of important.
So you would move away from an arms race scenario and speak about...
Well, it's still an arms race if, it's just an asymmetrical. You could kind of say, my first is a weapon matching arms race, and my second one is an asymmetrical arms race. So what could Russia keep up? The asymmetrical one? And sure, it could, but what the costs of that are. And I think that would be something that would have some value as a paper, right? Getting beyond just this, kind of very big question, but, something that had some...
Yeah, and using this разумная достаточность. What would be the capability that Russia will consider to be sufficient?
And then some interesting things, like, I think, I don't necessarily agree. I think there's some problems there, but, you can explore the societal dimension part, and you can play with the social contract, etc. But I would caution you, if the U.S. is doing all this crazy stuff with Trump and, saying it's nuclear, primacy, etc., I think that, that would goad Russian people to sacrifice a bit more, right? Especially if kind of the status was. The Trump thing is really about status. What we don't have more nuclear weapons than the Russians, and the Chinese are building that. No, we have to be number one, right? So I think that would goad, at least kind of make these limited sacrifices more acceptable.
Yeah, that's one of the things we are trying to explicitly contend.
Well, actually, Andrei told most of the stuff I wanted to tell the second time. No, I just want to join Andrei in his thesis that it should be really clear because, for example, I have a question. What does it mean? Can Russia afford the nuclear race? Does it mean just deterrence? Then Northern Korea, just like Andrei told, destroys all your methodology because it's technologically incapable, budget is so small, and still it deters, right? If we can argue, of course, that Russia seeks a kind of a high level of deterrence. Then we can say that okay, Russia wants equality, right, in the number of warheads and all this stuff. But from this point of view, it means that Russia, in some capabilities, even surpass the United States. Okay, we have, nobody knows how many tactical warheads we have, but they say that actually more somehow. And generally, there is some kind of equality. We have the New START treaty, which will be probably prolonged for maybe 5 other years. Nobody knows, but still, it seems that it's kind of a stable situation. And you mentioned that there is some kind of debates, but honestly, I'm not a top expert in this, but if something can destroy the strategic deterrence, it is probably some other kinds of arms, like I don't know, cyber capabilities and all this stuff. Nobody think it in terms that United States and Russia can start a new nuclear arm race, and that United States wants to double or I don't know, to produce how many of new nuclear arm race, so Russia will be look weaker. So basically, just like Maxim said, maybe it makes sense to move somewhere. So it can be, you can move to the realm of doctrines and strategies, maybe to some extent. And that may be a strong argumentation. Okay, Russia is economically weaker, then Russia will probably is more interested in keeping some kind of arms control, keeping starts, I don't know, because Russia wants to somehow control the potential arms race.
This will be another article.
This may be another, yes. Or maybe, I don't know, look at arms race in a wider perspective. I don't know, not just focus on nuclear stuff, but it will make the topic too wide, maybe. So I don't know what to do here, but that basically. And second, you mentioned that, okay, my research question is, will Russia be able to kind of sustain it, right? So, okay, we are talking about what is it? Right? Is it an arms race, deterrence? What is it for Russia? What means effort? But another question: what means can Russia, I don't know, survive or sustain? How can you measure, I don't know, by calculations, if Russia ready to spend such a number of resources or not? That's a little bit, to some extent, speculative. There were, and it drives us to 60s and 70s, where people really try to calculate that this number of people, this number of economic resources, material resources, territory, and all this stuff. So in this case, Soviet Union will be able to survive, and America cannot survive, because Soviet Union can survive with 50 million died, and America with just 20 million died. So that's what they tried to do it in Rand Corporation at that time, and it's a good intellectual exercise, but it may be very vulnerable to reality. But again, I think that what is good is that you're developing a strong methodological framework, and you are trying to move from the world of speculations and opinions, because each expert on nuclear capabilities and arms race, at least in Russia, has his own opinion about this. Especially Dworkin has his own opinion, and sometimes it's very subjective. So you try to make it objective, but it's really difficult. So I wish you good luck.
Oh dear. I mean, it ties into our justification for why we want to do this, because, I mean, again, like in the expert community, most people say there will most likely not be an arms race, and in the extremity, Russia couldn't sustain it. Like, you don't get a lot of enemies when you propose that. But there are a lot of worries and guesses out there about the scenario, and I feel that especially a publication like IA wants to illuminate these questions. So our contention is, people are worrying about this. The President of the United States speaks about it and says, I mean, okay, we all know that he says crazy things, but it just happens to matter very much what he says and does. So he said, let there be an arms race if there'd be an arms race, on questioning by experts and journalists. And we take that as the justification to say, yes, it's all guesswork, 5,000 variables moving at the same time, interactions, path dependencies, and so forth. A nightmare for a social scientist. But we can provide a better guess than what is out there right now. And here's our best guess, and we make it very structured and open and so forth. And that's why, for example, we are also using indicators like research and development. We are simply saying, okay, our general assessment of this factor, like Russian technological capabilities, is that in the extreme scenario, very problematic. Moderate scenario, there might be some difficulties, but we think there would be something. And we establish that by going via different paths and saying, because of this, we have some reason for optimism, because of this, we have some reason for optimism, and so forth. So that's how we are trying to approach it. So I will take all of this on and try to make the best out of it.
You could operationalize the R&D better, maybe look at what areas are specifically good for, to avoid the soft tissue, soft toilet paper, the market, all this kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
Look physics, maybe ask these experts, physics, computational, those kinds of things. Because there's numbers, you can disaggregate it.
Right.
Might give you a better picture.
Yeah. Спасибо большое.
All right,
Yes.
thank you. Very nice.
Pizza waits you.